So we're moving along through this class very, very quickly. And so we're to lesson 20 already, and for the next two lessons, we're going to be talking about this thing called the church, and kind of diving in a little bit deeper. If you happen to take Intro to Discipleship, in Intro to Discipleship, there's a class that talks about the church, just very entry level, and then in this course, we talk about it in more depth. And so we're going to take this class in lesson 21 next week and talk about the church and what it's supposed to be. So we'll jump right in here. You've got some fill in the blanks, and we'll fill these things in, and we'll have some question and answer time. If you have a great question along the way, jot it down, and we can talk about that at some point here before we close. So first off, let's read this verse that you have at the beginning, Matthew 16, verse 18. Everyone have that in your notes? Let's read that together. It says, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." All right, name who spoke that quote. Jesus, right? Jesus says, "I will build my church," and he makes a pretty bold claim. He says the gates of hell will not prevail against it, right? So he's not talking about a weak church, a feeble church, a nice little, quiet church. He's talking about a pretty strong church here. And so some of this is going to be review. If you've been with us the past few Sundays over the summer, Pastor Charlie's been teaching from the book of Acts and teaching about what the church is, and so you've got some great teaching there. And if tonight wets your whistle and you want to dive in more, I encourage you to go to the website and go back and listen to those sermons from the book of Acts that Pastor Charlie was teaching, because there's lots of great stuff that we're not even going to get to in these next two classes, but a really great understanding from the book of Acts there about what the church is supposed to be like and what our church is called to be like. So Jesus makes this claim. He says, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." So first off, we're going to talk about what or who is the church. The Greek word for church, which shows up in the New Testament, the New Testament was written primarily in Greek, and so when it was recorded and written down, the word church was not written church. It was a word ekklesia, and this word ekklesia is a Greek word that in the common language it wasn't a new word, but it was a word that literally meant a group that was called out, a called assembly. An ekklesia is a called assembly. A church is a called assembly. And so the church consists of people who are a called assembly. And so we're going to look at three different things, three different ways that we as the church are called. The first one is that ekklesia literally means for somebody to be called out. You're not just called, but you're called out of something. And that's the term ekklesia, or church, literally means a gathering of the called out, an assembly of the called out. An event, a transition from lostness to salvation. If you guys think if we read the Gospels, right, Jesus is going around, and as Jesus begins his ministry, he goes and he begins to encounter some guys, and he begins to call those guys to follow him, right? If we think of some examples of some guys, what types of things were the disciples doing? The guys who would become the disciples, they were fishers, right? What else were they? What other types of things were they? Tax collectors, yeah. So these guys are doing different things, right? They're going about their business, and Jesus comes to them and calls them out of what they are doing, and he says, "Hey, I want you to stop doing that, and I want you to follow me." And they said, "Great, awesome, I'm going to follow you." And he says, "I'm going to make you fishers of men. I'm going to change you. I'm going to change your life as you begin to follow me." It's interesting that these disciples, the disciples in that time period, whatever your profession was going to be, you would go and you would be an apprentice to somebody. You would take a while to become. They didn't have college back then, but the way that you became a tradesperson, or the way that you joined a career field, is that you would become an apprentice to somebody, and you would be an apprentice for a few years, and then you would finally become that. If you were going to become a fisher, you would be an apprentice for a while. If you were going to be a carpenter, you would be an apprentice for a while. If you were going to be a priest in the temple, you would study under the priests, and they would select you at a young age for that profession, and you would get to do that. What's interesting about the disciples is the disciples were past that age. All of the disciples were guys that would have been passed over to be priests. They were going about their profession, but Jesus went and he called them out of where they were, and he said, hey, I want you to be my disciples. He said, I'm choosing you for the priesthood, which to these guys who had been looked over by the establishment, this would have been a big deal. Jesus was calling them out. And the church is a gathering of called out people. Not because just as disciples were not great people, Jesus didn't select them because they were wonderful people. In fact, they were sinners when he found them. But he called them out just as you and I were sinners when Christ called us. And we've been called out. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. It says, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You who were once not a people, but are now a people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. So this verse talks about how we've been called out. If we think back to how we were when Jesus found us, many of us we have a great testimony of how I used to be like this, but by the grace of God, I've changed. Not because I've just become a good person, but because God's begun to change me. And so this is a gathering of the called out people. There's an insight here. If this event has not occurred in your life, if you have not been called out, if you are just the same as you have always been, it's probably a sign that real transformation has not taken place, that we've really not submitted to the call of Christ. The call of Christ demands that we begin to change. Christ does not, by his grace, does not leave us the same that he found us. When we go around this church and we hear people's testimonies are that I was this way, and by the grace of God, he's begun to change me. It wasn't an overnight process, but there was a transformation that's happening. And all of us are going through that transformation. None of us are perfect. All of us are still sinners in the process of being saved and being sanctified. And so that's what we are. We're a gathering of the called out. We're also a gathering of those who are called together. So the church is those who are called out. It's also those who are called together. An assemblage, a coming together of believers. So this term ecclesia speaks to us being called out, but it also speaks to us being called into an assembly. Not just called out of sin, but also called to something different. Right? We weren't just called out of bondage, but we were called then to submit to Christ. We're no longer slaves to sin, but now we've become bondservants or slaves to Christ. We just haven't been called out, but we've also been called together. Acts 2:47, let's read this together. It says, and the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. Right? So this verse implies that when these people were called out of darkness, right, they were saved. Not only were they called out of darkness, but what happened? They were added to the church, right? They became a member of the church. They became a participant. They became somebody who was called together with the believers. They began to meet with the believers, and that church began to grow and grow and grow as more people were saved. As a nice illustration here that Pastor Charlie added into this message that I think is a great one is that during a Sunday school class there was a teacher, and she was teaching her Sunday school class, and a little boy comes in late, and the little boy has a broken arm. And so the teacher's thinking as that boy walks in, she says, I want to be conscientious. I don't want to do anything that is going to make this boy be subconscious about the broken arm that he has. And so she was very careful not to draw attention to it or not to ask him to do something with both hands or whatever. And so as they go through their class, everything's going great. The little boy's participating just fine. But they come to the end of the class, and at the end of the class, they have their traditional way of closing down their class. And so the teacher says, "Okay, kids, let's make our churches. Did you guys make church like that in Sunday school when you were a kid? You put your hands together." And this little boy's got a broken arm, so he can't make his church. And the teacher realizes, she says, "You know what? I've pointed out that this kid doesn't have another arm to use." And just as that happens, the little girl next to him says, "Hey, Billy, here, we can make the church together," and puts her hand together, and they make the church together. It's an example of how we, as the church, it's the coming together that is supposed to take place. Not just a calling out, but a calling together. We're to be a family, to walk and grow together. A person who is added by the Lord when they are saved, it has to become part of the church. There is no genuine Christianity outside of the church. If you think when you were born, right, all of us were born. When you're born into a family. And thank God you're born into a family, right? Because as you grow up, the way that you want to do something is different than your parents want you to do it. And so your parents, by the grace of God, help to guide you and to bring you up. And there's conflict in the family. You want to do something different than everybody else wants to do, and so you've got to deal with that conflict, and there's tensions. But you know that growing up in that family prepares you for life, right? Those of us in this room know that when you get married, when you're single, a lot of times you think you got everything figured out, and you're a really great person, and you get married, and you start to realize, man, you know what? I got some flaws. I got some things I still need to work on, right? Can anybody attest to that? Anybody know that that's true? Andrew, that you're newly married, you know how that works. Doing life together is important for us. When we're off on our own, when we just are doing our own thing, it's easy to think that we have it all figured out. But as we do life together in a family situation or in a marriage situation or in a church situation, these are processes that God uses to grow us, to develop us. And that's why people say, but sometimes there's tension in the church. Sometimes there's disagreements. Yeah, that should happen. That's part of the process. We grow through those experiences. When there's tension and we're forced to resolve it the way that the Bible tells us we're supposed to resolve it, that causes us to grow. That causes us to develop as believers, as followers of Christ. And so this is part of the process. And so we're people that are called out. We're also people that are called together. And thirdly, we're called for. We're called for total obedience to Jesus Christ. So we're called out of how we used to be. We're called into an assembly, and we're also called for a purpose. Christ did not call us out for no reason, but Christ called us for a purpose, and that purpose involves the total obedience, the submitting of our will to Christ. Just as before we were saved, we submitted to our sinful natures and we did what our sinful natures told us to do. When we become Christians, when we come into relationship with Christ, we begin to submit to Jesus and to His will. Instead of my own will being what dictates me, I begin to follow Christ and do His will. John 14:23. Let's read this one together as well. It says, Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Right, so this is a wonderful promise. Jesus tells this person, he says, if you really love me, you'll obey my commands. And there's a promise that comes with that, right? He says that when that happens, we get to be in fellowship with Christ. We get to be in fellowship with God the Father. They come and make our home, right? That's talking about an intimate relationship. So some insight here is that those who are members of the church, we have to keep Christ's commands. If we want to be part of this, if we're going to be part of this, if we're going to be walking in that right relationship with Christ, it involves us keeping those commands, actually doing what He says, which we know, those of us that are trying to live that out, that's difficult sometimes, right? And so there's grace and everything, but that's an ongoing thing. We submit to the commands of Jesus Christ. A little note here is that ecclesia can refer to both the universal church and the local church. So as we read the New Testament, this word ecclesia pops up in the Greek, and it refers to both the universal church, or everybody who's a Christian all around the world, every tribe, every nation. This thing that we're involved in isn't some local thing, but it stretches to every continent. It stretches through every through every nation, through every tribe. It's something that's a big thing. And so the universal church would be all of that, but also the universal church is seen in a local place, right? We've got a church here, and there's other churches that come together, and so the local church is also a part of this. There's the universal church, all of us together, regardless of denomination or what pastor we sit under, or the universal church. But then there's also the local church, which is vitally important. It's how the church is seen in the community. It's where people worship together, learn together, grow together, live life together, and serve together. And so this is important for us to understand that there's this distinction, that there's those two things that are actually intertwined. They both are part of the same thing. So how is the church structured? Number two, how is the church structured? There's a popular misconception. Pastor Charlie talked about this 2 weeks ago in his Friends Day message. And he said, we were running into a lot of people that say, you know what, well, I don't believe in organized religion, right? Anybody ever met somebody that said, I don't believe in organized religion? Nobody else has heard people say that? Anybody themselves say, I don't believe in organized religion? I went through a period of time where I said, I don't believe in organized religion. I don't know what I was saying, but that was like the cool thing to say. But the point is, though, is okay, so you don't believe in organized religion, so you would prefer that it be unorganized, right? People want to be involved in things that have organization to them, right? When we play sports teams, Pastor Charlie said, like if you play in a band, you play on a sports team, we want to be a part of something that's organized. And obviously God, who the Bible tells us that he so loved the world that he sent his son, Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ said that I'm going to reach to the ends of the earth by using my church. Obviously, he's going to want some organization to this thing because he's going to want this thing to succeed, right? We want to win. When a company says, you know what, hey, the numbers are down, one of the first things a lot of times they do is they restructure, right? We need better organization. We need this thing to move better. So the church has some organization to it. So it's important for us to understand this. We as humans don't tolerate things that are unstructured for very long. And we know God in his creation, God invented organization, right? I mean, you think about how God created the universe. It wasn't just haphazard, right? We know it was indefinite time periods. It was indefinite ways, and he made sure that there were two of a kind, and there's order to things. We know how long a day is going to be. A day isn't 32 hours this week, and it's always 24 hours, right? We know how many days are going to be in a week, how many hours are going to be in a day, how many days are going to be in a year. We've got this stuff figured out because there's order to this thing. And so in the same way, there's order to the church. The church is a living and spiritual organism, but it also includes organization. Some of you guys that have a gift of administration, you say amen, and some of you guys that just want to pray and fast, and you say, no organization. We want to, right? So, but there needs to be organization to make this thing flow and make this thing work. So there must be balance, right? We've got to have the spirit, and we've got to have that, but we also need some organization to make sure this thing can move forward and go. And luckily, we didn't have to make this up for ourselves, but God sets up some of this. First, we're going to look at three main channels that God uses for government. And the first one is one that we talked about last week, right? Pastor Mike taught a lesson in here last week on the home. Is that correct? Yeah, it's a great lesson, right? And so the first channel that God uses for government is the home government, right? God sets it up so that you think about the genius of this, that God sets up a family and there's a mother and a father and the children are raised in that house and they get to learn things and they're born and if you just left the child to his own devices, who knows how he would turn out, but luckily mom and dad are there to help him. And so the home government. The second way is the church government, which we're going to talk about in more depth. There's a Bible reference there to Hebrews 13:17. A third method that God uses is the civil government. And there's some references there about how God uses the civil government. It's important for us to understand the more that these first two break down, the more that the home government breaks down and the more that the church government breaks down, the more you need the civil government to step things up. If the home government is working well and the church government's working well, you can deal with having a government that's more hands-off. But some of the things that we're seeing in our society where the government has to get more involved, it's because these first two aren't doing their job. If the home government's working out well and kids aren't being orphaned and kids aren't being, right? If the church government's working, right? It keeps some of this stuff from needing the civil government, the government to take care of things. And so these are the three methods that God uses, and these are all God appointed, and he uses all of these. So let's look at the basic church government. We talked about the home last week, and we're going to talk about the church this week and next week. First, it's important for us to understand that Jesus is the head of the church. Right? The number one guy who calls the shots, who sets up the organization, who calls the plays on the field. The guy who is in charge of this all is Jesus. He is the chief shepherd. So Jesus is the chief shepherd of this whole organization, the universal church and of the local church. The head of this church is not Pastor Charlie or Pastor Arlie, but it's Jesus. And when we pray that every church, the head of them is Jesus, and the head of all of us is Jesus. We ultimately look to him. There's two offices, though, that are laid out in the Bible. Two offices within the church that we see, and those are elders and deacons. Two offices that are described in the Bible, people that are elders and people that are deacons. Philippians 1:1, this letter here, it says, from Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Jesus Christ who are in Philippi, with the bishops and the deacons. And so you're writing this letter here, and they acknowledge the people that are bishops and deacons, or elders and deacons. So Jesus is the head of the church. And secondly, elders rule and oversee and feed and guard and protect the church. So these elders are under shepherds. So if we're thinking an organizational chart, we've got Jesus, and right underneath Jesus in the local church, because the primary way that God uses to reach people on earth is not angels, right? Anybody know anybody that their testimony includes an angel came and spoke to them? It's few and far between, right? Usually the testimony is somebody invited me to church, I heard the word of Jesus. Somebody told me about Jesus and I prayed and accepted. God primarily uses people. And so he places some people in the role of elders. And there's three main ways that this word is used in the New Testament. The word elder is used in some different offices that we talk about today. The first one is elder. This is somebody who's not a newbie or a novice, but is somebody who's experienced and mature. Can anybody name an elder in community church? Yeah, Bo and Lori Carlisle, right? I heard somebody say, yeah, Bob and Nancy Huff are elders. David and Evelyn Della Penna, yes, those are elders. We have also a second way that this term is used is a pastor. The word pastor and elder are used interchangeably in the Bible. It'll sometimes be talking about somebody, it'll call them a pastor, it'll call them an elder. They're used interchangeably. These people are shepherds who feed, protect, and guard. And we have some people that have the position of pastor in our church. As the Bible looks at it, though, these terms are used interchangeably. The roles are a little bit different, as we see, right? We have some people that primarily are doing the oversight, and we also have some people that are in this role of an elder. Pastor Charlie is an elder. Pastor Mike's an elder. But they are functioning in the role of preaching and exhorting and shepherding. And then also another way that this is exhibited is in the role of a bishop. A bishop is also referred to as an elder, and this is somebody who oversees, rules, and who watches over. So somebody who has the role of bishop. That's not something that in our tradition we use a whole lot, talking about somebody being a bishop, unless you remember back to the man who called Pastor Arlie up here. Some of you guys that have been with the church for a while remember Bishop Mears. Bishop Mears is a man who pastored in this area for years, closer to D.C., and he called Pastor Arlie when he was living in South Carolina. He was a guy who was a pastor to pastors. He was a bishop. And he said, hey, you need to come to Northern Virginia and plant a church. And even though we don't call Pastor Arlie a bishop, Pastor Arlie is kind of in the role of a bishop now. He oversees the churches that we've sent out, and he goes and he follows up with them and checks on our missionaries, and he pastors pastors. He's functioning kind of as a bishop, somebody who rules and oversees and watches over. And so this is all kind of confusing, but these offices are all part of this title, elders, that we see in the Bible. So Jesus sets up some structure, some organization to his church, right? Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns about this section? I know this can be kind of confusing. So you're like, so these are all elders, but they have different names. And clear as mud? We good? Clear as mud. All right. Wow. There's some further study here if you want to dig in a little bit more there. Particularly the qualifications in 1 Timothy. there's important qualifications for somebody who's going to hold this office. You don't just throw anybody up there and say, hey, will you be a pastor? Hey, will you be a bishop? Will you be an elder? There's some qualifications that you need to have. And so thirdly, we said that there's these two main offices. There's elders, and then there's deacons. Deacons are people who are set apart, who have distinguished themselves by a proven track record of serving. So your fill in the blank there is that they've been set apart. In a church, the elders, the pastors, will usually call out a group of people that are called deacons. These deacons are people who have a track record of serving. They've given themselves to Christ. That's usually not their main occupation. They a lot of times do other things, but they are servants. This is something that's been laid out in the Bible. In Acts chapter 6, verse 1 through 6, you can go back there and you can read it. But the first deacon is appointed there. There's an issue where they need to, they're feeding widows, and they say, you know what, we've got all these elders and these pastors, and we need somebody to help feed these widows. We need somebody to serve and do stuff. And so they find some people in the church, you can read about it there, and set them apart to take care of that business. But a deacon literally means servant. It means to serve, to assist, to attend, to wait on. And these terms define what the function of a deacon is. So we have people in this church who are deacons. We have some deacons in this room. Anybody know who in this room is a deacon? Yes. Brother Bill and Sister Sherry Irvin are deacons in this room. We have a number of people around this church that are deacons. They're servants. They've been set apart as an example, and also because they have a track record of just serving. They give themselves to service. This is a biblical office that's set apart as part of this structure that Christ provided for his church. And there's some further study there. If you want to read a little bit more about that, you can feel free to do that. So if you turn over to page 4 here, we've got a diagram here, a structure diagram. And you'll see at the top we've got the community at large. Oh, you don't? Hey, I get the draw then. Sweet. Okay, so here, draw an upside-down triangle with me. Everybody got that? You get to see my mad art skills. So we got a triangle. Now we're going to draw some lines on this triangle. It's an inverted pyramid. Yeah, so 5 lines across it like that. Cool? We good? So we'll put up here at the top. The top is the community. So we can for us we can say this is like Loudoun County, right? Or Northern Virginia. Right, so that's Loudoun County. And then we can write in here, you can write in congregation. So we have the community. This kind of gets smaller, right? Our community is like 300,000 people, right? The congregation at Community Church on the average Sunday is about 1,200 people. Then within that congregation, right? Not all of those people are members, right? Some of those people just show up and watch, right? But then there's some of us that are members, right? All right, so there's members then. And then within the members, there's an even smaller group that are deacons. And then elders. And then ultimately we have Christ, we have Jesus. So this is kind of showing how, this is a structured diagram that kind of shows we've got Jesus, the elders, the deacons, the members. the congregation, the community, and you can see it gets a little bit smaller as it goes down because there's only one Christ. There's more elders, there's even more deacons, there's members, there's congregation, and there's community. And the authority flows from Christ through it all, the spiritual authority. And so as we said also with elders, we remember that there's a plurality there of elders that assist. We've got our senior pastor, we have pastors that are underneath them, we have our elders that are our elders that we talked about. And so this is kind of a structural diagram. Anybody questions about this? Does this help make sense of things? Does this help at all? You guys are like, finish up. We need to go home. It's rainy. So, all right, cool. Very quickly, we're going to do discussion questions at the end with your group. Very quickly, though, just at the table that you're sitting at. Just at the table that you're sitting at with like 2 minutes here. Look at the 3 main channels for which God governs our lives and explain to the person sitting next to you which of these you've struggled with most and why. Very good. So there's some struggle within these ways that God governs, right? There's struggle in this, right? And that's part of the process. God uses these governments that He set up to help us grow as people, right? It helps us to a lot of times struggle and difficulty causes us to grow and develop into the men and women of God that He's created us to be. And so that's a wonderful thing. So we're going to finish up here tonight's lesson. We're going to continue talking about the church next week. But tonight's lesson, we're going to ask the question, what is the purpose of the church? Why does this thing exist? What's the purpose for this thing? Why do we do this thing week in and week out? Why would God institute something called the church, this ecclesia, this gathering of people who are called out, who are called together, who are called for? What's this thing all about? First, we're going to look at 2 directives from Jesus. Right? If Jesus is the head of this thing, he's the chief shepherd of this whole organization. We're going to look to Him. He gives us a couple really great clues to what this whole thing's about. The first one is the Great Commandment. In Matthew 22, Jesus is teaching, and he gives a pretty lofty commandment. This is not the great suggestion or a really great idea, or some principles you could possibly apply to your life to be blessed by God. But this is a commandment. And we said if we're going to be followers of Christ, if we're going to be members of His church, we have to obey His commands, and this is the big one. This is the $1 million commandment. And so let's all read this one together. It says, Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind." And first great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hangs all the law and the prophets. Wow, right? So Jesus says, let me sum up the Old Testament for you real quick, right? He says you want to be good. Of course, He sets the bar really high, right? Has anybody succeeded in doing this whole thing? No. Thank God for the grace of God, right? Thank Jesus for the cross. Thank You for His shed blood, because without that, there's no hope. But with that, we have this great commandment. He says you should love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, and all of your mind. And He says you don't stop there. The second part is that you've got to love your neighbor as yourself, right? And the implications of that are huge, right? How do you love your neighbor as you love yourself? I mean, the implications of that, we could go on all night talking about what that means as far as taking care of them, how we treat them, what we do for them, it's a mile long. But Jesus gives us this commandment. I want us to circle a couple phrases in there. It says, love the Lord, right? Jesus says the first part is for us to love the Lord. The second is to circle where it says, love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. It's kind of the tagline of Community Church. A lot of times under our logo we write loving God, loving people, right? A lot of churches have this because we didn't make it up and get in the boardroom and talk about it, but Jesus said it. He said you should love God and you should love people. And we know that both of those can be a challenge, right? If we're honest. Hopefully loving God's not too difficult for us, but man, loving people's tough, right? It is. But it's not an option. It's not like something that we get to choose if we want to do it, or even really choose how we're going to do it. We're commanded to do it. And so if we're going to look at why the church exists, the first thing we have to look at is that we've got to love God and we've got to love people. And if we're going to love people the same way that we love ourselves, then that's got to say things about how we treat our opinions. Sometimes in church people say, well, I don't like it. Yeah, but if we're going to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, we have to think about what they like, not just what I like, not just what I think. But what does he think? How does it make him feel? What are his preferences, right? Because if I'm supposed to love him the way I love Jesus, I do that stuff for myself all the time. I always think about, well, what do I like? What is my, right? I mean, we all do that. But Jesus tells us we're supposed to do that for our neighbors as well. And the second directive that Jesus gives us is the Great Commission. Do you realize that Jesus commissions all of us? He when he calls us out, when he calls us together, when he calls us for something, he gives us a commission. I grew up in a church. I grew up in a denominational church. I won't name the denomination. But I grew up in a denomination, and it's one of these denominations where they have the conveyor belt of pastors that come through, right? They change pastor every few years. And they do this because the church thinks that the pastor's job is to do ministry, right? The church doesn't do ministry. They hire the pastor, and they pay the pastor so the pastor can do ministry. And then at the end of the year, they get together and they vote on whether the pastor did enough ministry. And if they don't think he did enough ministry, they send him off and get a new pastor, and they pay him to do ministry. But Jesus goes a little deeper than that. He doesn't just call pastors or elders or deacons to do ministry, but when Jesus calls us out, he calls all of us and commissions all of us to play a part in this role. We're all supposed to go into our world and make disciples, and so he gives us this commission. And so Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Let's read this together. It says, Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of this age. Amen. It's kind of interesting how Jesus starts this out, right? Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth, right? So if you're reading this and you've never heard the gospel before, you would tend to think that what Jesus is about to say is going to be different, right? Jesus says, all authority has been given to me on heaven and earth. Jesus calls the shots in heaven and on earth. So then Jesus says, so this is how I'm going to do things. I'm going to have you go into all the worlds. I mean, wow, that's a commission. Jesus says, I can do this however the heck I want. I'm in charge, right? I mean, that's basically what he says. He says, I call the shots in heaven. I call the shots on earth. My method for reaching people on earth, which is my goal, is to use you. Not me, I'm going to heaven. I'll be with you, but you're going to go into all the earth, and you're going to tell people. I'm not going to send angels. I'm going to give you pastors to help you. I'm going to give you elders. I'm going to put deacons in the church to set an example. But I'm calling you to go into the world and to do these things. Jesus commissions his disciples and commissions us, those of us who are called out of darkness into light. We're called together, right? Because we can't do this on our own. If we're going to reach the world, right, we've got to work together. You're not going to reach the world, I'm not going to reach the world. But together, man, we can put a dent in this thing. Right? Pastor Charlie's cast the vision. He said, man, there's 300,000 people in Loudoun County. Not a lot of them go to church. We've got the stats. Over 95% of them don't go to church. That's a lot of people, right? And if we believe what the VeggieTales Bible says and all the other Bibles, that's not good because we're called to reach those people. We've been commissioned to go into Loudoun County and to reach those people who don't go to church. How's that going to happen? Us going into the world, doing this commission. So why does the church exist? The church exists to fulfill the Great Commission and to fulfill the Great Commandment. Under this Great Commission, I want us to circle a couple words. Make disciples is the first one there. You see it says in verse 19, it says, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. That's pretty big, right? This is one of the reasons that, some people say, why do we send money to Haiti? Why do we send money to Honduras? Why do we send money to Peru? Well, because they say we've got needs here. Yeah, we've got needs here, but we're also called to go into all the world. And so we're gonna take care of some needs here, but we're also, when the opportunity arises, we're gonna help underprivileged kids in Haiti that can't get an education because of the state of things there, or we're going to help kids in Honduras that are being sold by their families into the sex trade. We're going to try and help them because we've got some friends over there that are doing the work of Christ in that nation, and so we're going to help support them. And so we're going to make disciples, right? And we know all of us, we're in the process. All of us are in the process of being discipled, and this discipleship track that we're a part of is part of that, and we're called to help bring other people through that as well. And then the second thing that I want us to circle is the phrase there. It says, teaching them. So the church is called to love God, to love people, to make disciples, and to teach them, right? Those are some big picture ideas of why the church exists. What's the purpose of the church? The purpose of the church is to love God, is to love our neighbors, is to make disciples, and is to teach them. So those are those things. And if we were to accomplish those, we'd be in pretty good shape, right? Those all take some work, right? And so we're going to look at four things here. The church exists to love the Lord God with all of your heart. This is worship, right? How do we love God with all of our heart? It's worship. Not just singing songs. It includes singing songs, but living a lifestyle of worship, right? As we worship God in all that we do, it didn't just say with words. It says that we're supposed to worship Him with heart, with soul, and with mind, right? As we sit here in Catechism and we sit here in Discipleship 101 and we open up the Bible and we fill in blanks here, we're using our minds. Using our minds is an act of worship to God, right? He gave them to us. We're smarter than the other creatures that He created for a reason. And as we use our minds in a godly way, it's edifying. It's an act of worship to God. And so worship is the first one there. There's a couple quotes from Psalms there. Let's read Psalm 34, verse 3. It says, "Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt His name together." So the purpose of the church, we're going to worship God. If the church doesn't worship God, who's going to worship God, right? We're called together for this purpose to worship God. The second thing is that we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is ministry. These are programs, services. These are the visible demonstration of God's love, right? As a church, we're called to visibly display God's love to people in a selfless way. And so all these ministries that we do, all these things, Messiah's Market, Fire Escape, Triple C Ranch Day Camp, love projects that we do, these things they're supposed to show the love of God to people. These things are ministry. These are us loving our neighbors as ourselves. And as Pastor Charlie told us at the beginning of the year, as he was casting some vision, he said he sees these things happening in different parts of the county. We're going to go into places in the county, and we're going to say, hey, how can we selflessly serve here? How can we build a teen center in this community to help? We heard the sheriff say that there's gang violence here. How can we help with that? We're going to be selfless. We're going to serve. This is ministry. So the church is called for worship, for ministry. Under ministry, it's important that every member is a minister, right? We looked at this Great Commission here, and we said Jesus commissioned us. He told us to go, right? Jesus tells his disciples, he says, all authority has been given to me. Go. Go. Don't just stay seated. Don't just sit there, but you're supposed to go and do something. So every member a minister. The third purpose here is to make disciples. This is evangelism. So the church exists for worship, for ministry, and for evangelism. In Acts 1:8, it said, there's a quote from Jesus there where he says, "You will be my witnesses." And he goes on and he tells them where they're going to be witnesses in their local community, in the bigger community at large, and to the ends of the earth. We're going to be our witnesses. You're going to witness to Jesus. We're going to evangelize. We're going to tell people about Christ. Acts 20, verse 24. Let's read that together. It says, "But my life is worth nothing unless I use it for doing the work assigned to me by the Lord Jesus, the work of telling others the good news about God's wonderful kindness and love." Wow. That's a bold statement there, right? But that's the truth. As Christians, we believe that it's our call to tell others, not just to keep it to ourselves, but we're supposed to share it with others. Man, Christ changed my life. Imagine what he can do for you. And that's supposed to be our message. So evangelism. And then number 4, the fourth purpose of the church is this teaching them or discipling. This is ongoing growth and maturity. There is no end to discipleship, right? We are constantly being discipled. We're constantly growing. And this is something that happens within the church and within our relationship with Christ. And Colossians 2, verse 7 and 8 talk about this. But so the church exists for worship, for ministry, for evangelism, and for discipleship. We're called to fulfill the great commandment and to fulfill the great commission. Any questions or comments about that last section there? What is the purpose of the church? We've got our hands full, right? We need Christ to help us. If we are a church that does not have the help of the Holy Spirit, then we have no hope, right? We're going to close out with our discussion.